First, Bill O'Reilly goes off the deep end with the attack tonight on NBC News. So over the top that we changed our show after hearing it less than an hour ago. Now, Bill's suggesting that the New York Times wrote a negative article about ABC's Charlie Gibson because World News Tonight's edging out NBC in the ratings for the first time in, I think, like a year. Well, take a look at what Bill had to say about what he thinks about this vast left-wing media conspiracy.
In a blatant attempt to prop up the fading NBC Nightly News, Stanley attacked ABC News anchor Charles Gibson, calling him lazy and saying he got his anchor job by default. Stanley writes, quote, Mr. Gibson hasn't exactly overexerted himself in his new job. This week while Brian Williams is in Iraq, Mr. Gibson is on vacation, unquote. Is Miss Stanley desperate or what? Charles Gibson is not entitled to take a vacation? Completely absurd. Stanley is denigrating Gibson because he is beating Williams and because the New York Times and NBC News are ideological soulmates, sympathetic to the far left and hostile to people with whom they disagree. Talking Points has no problem with Brian Williams, but NBC's coverage remains dubious.
You know, they beat us in February for the first time in 10 years. And anybody that's read Alessandra Stanley's columns, like about Katie Couric back when she was with the Peacock Network, Bill, would understand that she goes after everybody. That's her job. But, you know, that was just the beginning. That's just funny. It's delusional. This got personal and nasty very quickly. Bill O'Reilly then turned his guns on one of the bravest and most respected correspondents in Iraq, a guy who's put his life on the line for years. His name, Richard Engel.
What Richard Engel and Brian Williams did not report last night is that violence has dropped about 80% in Baghdad since the surge, according to the Army. Mr. Engel is a brave man, but has consistently taken an anti-war position in general. That's not what correspondents are supposed to do.
You know, that's just a lie, and we'll get to that in a second and show you why he's lying. The big question is, what's Bill O'Reilly's obsession with NBC? And has he gone too far this time by attacking a brave war correspondent from the safety of his Washington, D.C. studio? Right now with us again, MSNBC contributor and Boston Herald columnist Mike Barnicle. Also, John Funn from the Wall Street Journal. You know, we can all laugh at Bill O'Reilly and him going after NBC all we want, Mike Barnicle, but it seems to me that when he attacks Richard Engel from the safety of his cushy D.C. studio, he's really crossed the line here, hasn't he?
Well, what line is there to be crossed in cable, Joe? I mean, where is the line in cable? Look, I like Bill O'Reilly. I've known him a long time. I can't figure out what he's trying to do here. Is he so mad at Keith Olbermann that he's lashing out at NBC and Richard Engel? Richard Engel needs no defense. And Bill, in his commentary that we just heard, his indication that violence is down 80% in Baghdad, according to the Army. Well, it's Richard Engel's job and the job of other correspondents in Baghdad, a very difficult war to cover, an almost impossible war to cover in terms of physically covering it. It's his job to figure out the truth between the 80% that the Army says and what is the reality on the streets. And it's a daily and lethal job that they're doing.
It is a tough job that they're doing, John Funn. Do you think Bill O'Reilly had it right?
Anytime you focus on personalities rather than the substance, I think you're probably going down a blind alley. The whole Brian Williams, Charlie Gibson thing is just weird. As for Richard Engel, I don't know specifically all of his reports, but I do know this. Al Jazeera, not our friends, has reported there is a dramatic reduction in violence in Baghdad in certain neighborhoods, and overall the situation has stabilized in other neighborhoods. So,
but John Funn, hold on though. I mean, and that's the point. I mean, Bill O'Reilly said that Richard Engel and NBC did not report yesterday that violence dropped. I want to read you this because, you know, this is important. Every day the White House releases an Iraq update where the White House, not Al Jazeera, not Fox News. The White House cites news stories that it chooses to highlight. Tuesday's edition noted 3 NBC News stories. The first was from an interview Brian Williams did with retired General Wayne Downing, who's quoted as saying U.S. soldiers are proud of what they're doing in Iraq. The second's from NBC's Richard Engel, quoting Iraqis on the ground, saying they finally feel like there's security in their region. Engel also cited statistics from the U.S. military that indicated that violence was down, indeed down in Sadr City. And the third was an interview Brian Williams did with day-to-day commanders of U.S. troops in Iraq, and Williams said to the general, quote, "They just said they don't want us to leave." You know, that's the 10th time I've heard that today. What's troubling to me, John Fund, is that Bill O'Reilly goes on an hour ago. He claims Richard Engel didn't cite those Army statistics, claiming that violence was down 80%, when in fact Engel did last night, and in fact the White House quoted Engel. So Bill O'Reilly goes on his air, he lies about a reporter who puts himself in harm's way, and so many millions of Americans just digest it. Isn't that troubling?
Well, if that's the case, the research department sure failed. I'd be very interested to see what kind of comments along those lines Bill O'Reilly allows tomorrow night on his Opine segment, where he allows readers to write in and question him. That'll be the standard.
But, John, you do have a bigger problem with NBC News, don't you? Do you think it's liberal?
Well, there are parts of NBC which I think have sensationalized their coverage, so it's basically just a daily op-ed page. Keith Olbermann would be an example of that. Other shows are more balanced, yours included. I would say that in general, in the Iraq War, we have seen I think, too little attention paid to questioning the administration's premises for the war in the beginning, and now they've made up for that by going too far the other direction, reporting no good news. For example, tonight in another network, they literally made the statement the war is lost. So I think that there has been too much negativity, given the fact that the surge has to be allowed a chance to work.
Mike Barnacle, have people like Keith Olbermann and myself been too negative?
No, I mean, it's what you do, Joe. It's what Keith does. But I don't think we have paid enough attention, and I don't think the public cares about it, as a matter of fact, the degree of difficulty in covering this specific war. There are enormous numbers of good things happening in Iraq, thanks to the American Army, thanks to the American military, the Marine Corps. Enormous numbers of good things are happening. It's just almost impossible to get reporters to those places to cover those events. I think we're in the process now of seeing perhaps that just 2 major newspapers, the Times, New York Times, and the Washington Post, with established bureaus in Baghdad. My understanding is that the LA Times is beginning to phase out their bureau. We have a series of stringers representing American newspapers, but this is an impossibly difficult and dangerous war to cover.
It is so dangerous, and isn't that damning in and of itself? And let me ask you again, I want to ask you this, Mike. Why is it that Bill O'Reilly feels safe attacking Richard Engel from Washington, D.C., and why this obsession with NBC? Why does he lead his shows going after this network? What's he trying to prove?
Well, I mean, you'd obviously have to ask Bill, but I think clearly Keith Olbermann has gotten under Bill O'Reilly's skin with the worst person of the week deal. I think clearly that has bothered him, and I just wish that Bill would take on Keith rather than throwing Richard Engel into the hopper here, because he's an established correspondent. He's done an incredible job. He's got the credentials that any news organization would want in a correspondent. So if it's Keith versus Bill O'Reilly, let's get it on. Leave Richard Engel and the war in Iraq out of it. I absolutely agree with John Fund. When it gets down to personalities, what's the point?
John Fund, do you agree?
Look, reporters report, and I think you have to go after the substance. But one thing you don't want to do is do what Hillary Clinton did, which is invent some giant conspiracy. I do know that the New York Times and the NBC television network are not in bed together. I mean, they may share a certain worldview, but there's no coordination going on there. Having said that, I think the healthy criticism, it used to be the networks would never criticize each other. A certain amount of this, not focused on personalities, is very healthy. It's sort of like ombudsman. You're acting as the guard against excesses by any network, because you're going to be slammed by your competitor. Certain amount of that is fine, but let's keep it out of personalities.
And you know, John Fund, I agree with you completely. For too long, 3 networks just patted each other on the back, and the top newspapers did the same thing. I've got no problem with them going after each other. My question is, who's Bill O'Reilly's ombudsman going to be now? Now that we found out that he goes on TV, he lies about Richard Engel, he lies about NBC, he lies about statistics that he claims weren't given, and he just keeps barreling forward. Will Bill O'Reilly apologize to Richard Engel, and will he apologize to NBC?
You know, Bill O'Reilly went on the Colbert Report, and Colbert went on to Bill O'Reilly's report. I think it's about time that you go on the O'Reilly Factor and O'Reilly comes on your show.
Well, you know, I would love that to happen, and I would love us just to debate one issue. Who's the true conservative? I'll win that one any day of the week.
That would be a good topic, and I know you'd have some ammunition.
One thing, Joe. Cable TV, a lot of it is show business. Covering the war in Iraq, that ain't show business.
Exactly. We have to separate the two.
It is not show business at all, and I think covering the war is extraordinarily important. And I hope the first 30 to 45 minutes of this show every night is not show business. We try to tackle Iraq, Iran, the war on terror, and the important issues that face us. Now, the last 15 minutes, that is show business, and that's why we call it Hollyweird. Mike Barnacle, John Fund.